old and new business? Mayor Fleetwood.
I believe some of the council members have requested just a brief update on the status of efforts around Jerry Field and the disencampment there, and the fact, as we all know, the move over to Laurel. We remain actively committed to ending the encampment at Laurel Park. I think you know that when Jerry Field, when that effort began actively last week, there was movement towards Laurel Park. There was an effort to end that. A lot of people left. Some people came back. And I just wanted to let Eric Johnston give a brief overview of what happened with Jerry Field, and also hear from Brian Heinrich, our deputy administrator, on some of the actions that also took place last week. So if we could start with Eric Johnston, our Public Works Director, if that's all right with you, Council President Stone.
Yes, thank you, Mayor Fleetwood. Director Johnston.
Thank you. Just to be very relatively brief, as we have mentioned a couple of times with the council over the last couple of weeks, we are doing our best to strive to follow the standard process for dealing with camps that are reported to us by members of the community. It's been noted several times that we have many dozens of camps that are located throughout the community that the city is aware of, that have been reached out and contacted to by various service groups that you heard about this afternoon, including the HOT team. But from time to time, there are encampments that do need to be, as the mayor puts it, disencamped or cleaned up. Jared Field was one of those camps. And so that camp had been posted at least twice, once in early February, and we delayed the cleanup of that camp because of the pending very cold weather and opened the cold weather shelter for a period of time. But last week, we did need to proceed forward with the cleanup at Jerry Field. And so on Tuesday morning, the Public Works Department and the Parks Department, as a joint effort, mobilized a couple of crews early in the morning, about 7:45, 8 o'clock. And the first course of business was a couple of senior staff members, myself included, walked onto the site and wanted to make sure that it was safe for staff to proceed. And I mention that because we have at City Hall met with some resistance from members of the Bellingham Occupied Protest or the Mutual Aid Group, who have opposed efforts to clean up those park facilities. We were not met with any resistance. We were not met, well, I shouldn't say with any resistance. We were not met with, we were able to proceed forward and proceed our work. So we called the crews up and they started to do the work. They did start with sites that had not had many people in them for a period of time, and did allow for members of the community, including members of BOP, to come in and to move campers out of Jerry Field. We were careful, slow, and deliberate. We proceeded with caution. Wherever possible, we talked to campers individually. In many cases, we were not allowed to talk to campers because we were somewhat blocked by protesters. Some of the campers left and told us to clean up their stuff, and so we did. We were able to recover some salvageable property, so stuff that was clean, not soiled, did not have the presence of needles, and some of those personal property items were stored. We did take those off-site. Much of the material that we saw at Jerry Field was soiled, damaged, moldy, was not salvageable, and could not be stored safely. In total, we removed about 240 cubic yards of waste from that site. That's about 220 F-150 pickup trucks. And I'll mention then, this is not a criticism on the people living there by any stretch of the imagination. It's just a fact, if you will. That's the equivalent of about 550 people over the same period of time. So if I were to take a single family home, assuming about 3 people over a 6-week period and project that out, the equivalent number of people would be about 550. So there is an extraordinary amount of waste that was created of things that were not salvageable at this particular encampment. Many of the things that we were unfortunately needing to place in the waste disposal containers were unused clothing items still in their packages that had been left out to get wet. Food items, multiple large dogs of bag food is one example. Large bags of dog food, excuse me, that had unfortunately been allowed to spoil. Clearly the conditions there were less than sanitary for anyone, let alone the people who were living at that location. So a very large amount of debris that was needed to be removed that could not be salvageable. And one would ask, well, where did that material come from? And a lot of that material, I have to assume, maybe this is more commentary than fact, but was brought by donations. And I think we would, as staff, very much would prefer that those donations go to the existing service provider so that they could be stored and put to greater use rather than to these illegal encampments within city parks. In any case, the city staff was on board, was on scene from about 8 a.m. till about 2 to 3 p.m. Costs incurred by the Parks and the Public Works Department were about $27,000 for the day's efforts. That includes labor and equipment and materials. We have not yet got the full costs yet from SSE for the disposal of that 240 yards of material, but all things considered, it was a relatively it was a good day's work for our public works crew to be out there. Not a very pleasant environment. Certainly, none of us want to be involved with having to tell a person who's experiencing homelessness that they need to leave today. But we did make clear that there were opportunities available at the Lighthouse Mission at the base camp facility. The base camp providers were on site during that day for at least a short period of time. Many of the people who we talked to said they did not want to go to base camp or were under the impression that they could not go there. I would like to mention in particular that our crews did exceptionally well. They presented themselves with professionalism. They were calm and they were patient, and they did their work with efficiency that we would expect of public employees. And I appreciate that, and I enjoy working with them both on the Parks and the Public Works side of the house. We know that as they were leaving Jerry Field, they went over to Laurel Park, and later in that afternoon, anticipating that was going to happen, we were prepared to post that site. And so on Tuesday afternoon, as the camp cleanup at Jerry Field was proceeding, we had other crews who posted Jerry Field and put a date on there for Friday morning last week. I think that's it for Jerry Field, and probably turn to Brian for recap of Friday.
Sure. Thank you, Eric. Good afternoon. So as Eric said, we did post Laurel Park around 2:30 on Tuesday afternoon, and on Friday morning, a small number of us arrived at the park and were met by a small but fairly vocal group of folks, as Eric mentioned, likely affiliated with the Bellingham Occupied Protest. What was interesting is that within minutes of our arrival, that many of the campers began to pack up their belongings on their own, and they did begin to leave Laurel Park on their own. And by that afternoon, the park was nearly empty. During the course of the day, some folks who had organized previous protests brought their vehicles and loaded up a large number of belongings. You might be aware that they tried to establish other illegal camps maritime at the Lincoln Creek Transportation Center. They were deterred from doing so. And over the course of the weekend, they did return with those vehicles and the belongings. I think you'll find if you went by Laurel Park today, there are a large number of belongings, not very many campers per se, but there's a number of piles of hard to say what they might be, perhaps tents, tables, etc. Those are there today. Crews did return on Saturday morning to continue with the cleanup, but were deterred. And so we have, over the course of this, as Eric mentioned, with our Jerry Field approach, we've asked our staff to be non-confrontational. They're very professional. They are non-confrontational, and when we're faced with that, we do pull back. And so we're establishing what our next steps are currently, but that's where we're at today.
If I could mention one other thing about the amount of material we had to remove from Jerry Field. It was of interest to me, or note to me, that when we arrived there, the dumpster that had been provided was empty. So the dumpster that we had provided that was emptied by SSC on a regular basis, that particular morning, there was nothing in that small dumpster, nor was there anything in the 40-yard dumpster that had been delivered the day before. So the argument is that the reason there was so much waste and garbage at Jerry Field was because the city wasn't providing dumpsters. Kind of falls apart, because the facilities that were provided were not being used as efficiently and effectively as could have been. And that was similar to what we also saw at City Hall. And so when questions are asked of us, why is the city not providing dumpsters? One is that we do not provide dumpsters or other facilities for illegal use of the city parks. And two, when those facilities were provided, both at City Hall and then at Jerry Field, they are not appropriately used. And so it's unfortunate that we find ourselves in a position to have to hold that position, but that's where we are currently at.
Councilmember Anderson.
Thank you for recognizing me. First, thank you to the city and especially our parks and public works staff. It is a lot for us to ask them to go on site to a protest that can be quite confrontational. And I didn't know that staff had gone there on Saturday morning and was met with resistance from the protesters. So if you can extend my personal thanks to those staff members. Again, it's just something that is very difficult to put our city staff in that position. I have heard from a lot of residents around Laurel Park, and they're terrified. There's a lot of noise at night. Saturday morning, they woke up to dozens of pallets circling the park that one would assume was put there in order to create a protest resistance should the police show up. There's expectations that even though they have expressed a lot of compassion and, past support and current support towards homeless services, that this is basically a hostile takeover of the park by protesters and the collective. And unfortunately, some of our homeless community members are kind of wrapped up with that. So I do hope at some point the park can be returned so that other community members can safely use it. I've heard from people who do not feel safe going there because of harassment. And some people are feeling as though they're basically in a hostage situation and they don't feel safe leaving their homes, even to walk around there because of being confronted. And I know that the city staff and police are well aware of that, but I don't know if the community is well aware of that. This is not an isolated area. It's not a protest downtown. This is in a residential neighborhood where people are literally feet from this location. And when you have people who are using their hoses or their bushes for various business, and residents come out and say, please don't do that, and then they are confronted in a way that is inappropriate, that makes them feel jeopardized and unsafe. This is not tenable. We heard multiple times all the services that we are funding and putting together to assist the people who are without shelter. And yes, we cannot provide shelter to everyone's preference, but there is available beds. And this has to end. And I just trust that the city is looking at how this will be addressed and that we will not be talking about our neighbors' safety 2 months from now, as far as the way things had kind of elongated at City Hall and Jerry Field. And I know people are resistant to speak up because of the collective's harassment and doxing. I mean, there's been things on social media where council members' pictures of their homes have been posted along with their address and a call for protesters to go to their homes and make them uncomfortable. And I think it's important for the community to realize this and hear this, that this is a protest. And it is, there is an organization who is really targeting members of our community who speak up, who they're targeting council, they're targeting the mayor. I want to share that when my husband and I stood in front of Seth's house, when this protest went to go protest in front of his house, my husband was assaulted. Someone took a pole and smacked him up the center of the head for standing there. And we did file, he just recently filed a report on that. And he hesitated to do that because of fear of my safety. He didn't want to report it because his wife is a council member and he was afraid it would put a target on our house and it would put a target on me. But I think it's really important for the community to understand, you know, to stand in solidarity and say, we support your right to protest, but not to target our mayor's house and vandalize. My husband was hit with a stick in the middle of the head for standing there, and this is not okay. So this has to end. I mean, I know people are gonna come at me and say things, but this is not right. And this is not helping the people who are unsheltered, who are at that park, to be able to stand between them and services and outreach is wrong. To use people for a protest is wrong. So I'm just exposing it so that people are fully aware of what has been happening and make that part of the public record.
Thank you, Councilmember Anderson. Mayor Fleetwood,
Well, just a response. Councilmember Anderson expressed concern that the camp that has been started at Laurel Park might continue for a long duration. And I just want to express to you that that's not going to happen. I think you realize, for a lot of obvious reasons, we don't go into particular detail about aspects of an operation. But it will be coming to an end, and that's appropriate for many of the reasons that you described. This community cares very much about issues of homelessness. The last 2 hours in the presentation that was given by so many different service providers and our own staff is a testament to that. And the amount of money that this community has supported paying locally to address this issue is testament to that. You all made a decision to uphold our Bellingham Municipal Code, which has prohibitions against camping in public parks. Public parks are for everybody. And that's what we're enforcing in this case. There are a variety of places that people can go. We continue dedicated to building increased capacity in this respect. We all know about Lehigh and Road to Home that we're working to put up this spring. And I'm delighted to say that we're now at spring. Base Camp still has room for many people. We recognize the concerns that critics of our emphasis on that say. There are some people that can't go there. It's not right for everybody. We acknowledge that. There's also a lot of overstatement expressed by people when they overstate how many people can't get in there. Base Camp, the people at Lighthouse Mission have continuously said that that's overstated, and that in fact there's a process for reentry for most people there. And let's not forget that, and this is by no means a suggestion for any kind of ultimate solution, it's not, but it's important to remember that there were over 100 tiny encampments throughout our community that existed before November 11th, when the protest at City Hall began, that we did not enforce against. So I think that those things need to be made clear. But to your point, Councilmember Anderson, the Laurel Park tent encampment is going to be ended.
Councilmember Lillquist.
Kind of following on the nature of those last two comments. I wish that we could kind of go to the points where we actually, I think, almost everyone in the community agrees, which is sympathy for people who are experiencing homelessness and a willingness to commit public resources to helping out with especially long-term solutions to getting people back into permanent and stable housing, but also short-term stopgap sheltering. But instead, what we're dealing with is protests that the energy is being expended not on solutions, but on dealing with protests that I think are misinformed, misguided, misdirected, and counterproductive. They're ineffective. And they're ineffective because they're ignoring the essential truth, which is that this community cares and devotes millions of dollars every year and is helping out hundreds of people at this very moment in hundreds, multiple plural, in a variety of ways, in many different programs that are involved in securing stable, independent, dignified housing. And to ignore that entire iceberg and focus on this difficult tip, those who remain unsheltered, is to miss the bigger picture. And that's why those voices of protest will never be persuasive, because they're not focusing on the solution, which is the housing. And if they did honor their own call for housing for all, and then look at our housing system and realize, for example, the actions taken today to augment and improve the capacity for that housing system, they wouldn't be able to say, you're not doing anything, you're not caring, you're not paying attention. You can't listen to today's presentation or the one at their last meeting or the ones to come, or for that matter, a whole variety of other things, and say that we're not paying attention, that we don't care. So these protests are designed to shame council members and to shame the mayor and other community leaders, and also to shame the care providers as being part of a failed system. I don't feel ashamed, even though I know the system is less than it ought to be, less than it can be, less than it will be. I'm not ashamed for trying and not succeeding 100%. I'm only ashamed if I didn't try and didn't notice and didn't care, and none of that's true. So I'd like to get back to doing what we're doing, which is talking about solutions to homelessness, and that means housing, and that means shelter that is intimately tied to housing. And these protests are ways of creating conflict, but not solution. And I think that's their biggest failing, is that they're not going to lead to positive change.
Councilmember Anderson.
So I failed to mention something, just for full disclosure. If the protest was just solely about, we need to change our zoning, or we need to purchase more housing for individuals, not that I would understand, necessarily agree with their full methodology, but it would be a little bit more palatable in some respects, because it would be more transparent. But if you really look at the root of what they post and what they're calling for, it is about defunding police, and to defund police and then move that funding over to services. That is not in line with what the entire community would necessarily support. As council and city and management, we have a responsibility for all services towards our community, and we don't have finite dollars to do everything. And so we really try to provide balance. Personally, I feel we need law enforcement, And there's a lot of things from human trafficking to child pornography to theft to violence that we need officers in order to provide services and a certain amount of safety net to the community. And I know people will argue that and feel that officers are a problem, and you're entitled to that opinion. But there's a whole host of other community members and businesses and victims who rely on officers and investigation to provide relief for what has happened and hopefully preventative. So I think it's important for the community to understand that for full transparency is a lot of what they have stated, the goals around some of this protest is about defunding police. So it's just not about homeless and providing services. It's the means that they hope to be able to generate or motivate us, as it was mentioned, shame us, or in a way, I think, harass and threaten us in order to make meet an ends to that mean. But I think it's just important that the community understands the root of it and makes a decision about how they continue to support. As mentioned by Eric Johnson, there was a lot of community donations, and I'm not saying at all that the community should not care or donate to individuals who are needing those assistance, but I would just plead to the community that the graciousness and the generosity that you feel towards members of our community, please direct that towards well-established social services who have a successful track record of assisting people who are homeless. We heard from a lot of those providers today, and I know that, if you wanted to donate, 5 big bags of dog food, Humane Society, I'm sure, would welcome that type of donation. If you want to donate clothing and funding, I'm sure there are other agencies, especially monetary donations, Lydia Opportunity Council, Northwest Youth Services, all of them could utilize that generous support. And I do believe it would have a greater impact for the community that you're compassionate to assist.
I don't see any other hands at this time. A quick follow-up question, and then I had some comments of my own. But Mayor Fleetwood or Brian Heinrich or Eric Johnston, I don't know if there's any information that could be provided on 2 fronts. One, the number, if we have any approximate number of campers, right, who were, we'll say, displaced, right, from the clearing of Jerry Field and then at Laurel Park. I'm just curious, protest aside, if we have any indication of the number of actual campers.
That's a really difficult question to answer, definitively. Our estimates are that at Jerry Field, that the weekend prior to the cleanup, there were between 20 and 30 campers. The morning of, I don't think that we saw that many. I don't think we saw 30 campers. There were certainly more than 30 tents, but not all of those tents were occupied at that time. Sorry about that. And it's also safe to say that many of the tents were occupied by the same person. So we should not assume that one tent means one person, because sometimes campers had more than one tent. When we got to Laurel Park, and Brian can help me with this, when we arrived in the morning, there were between, rough count, about 25 tents on site. Don't think I could say that there were 25 campers, but there were about 25 tents on site. There were about 25 to 30 other people in the park at the same time. Some were helping, some were yelling at staff. That's okay. I don't mind being yelled at. There's nothing wrong with that. But it's really hard to say how many campers were there. So my guess, my thumbnail guess, and it is just a guess because it's hard to get a head count because people are obviously moving around, was that at Laurel Field, there were about 20 people on Tuesday morning. At the end of the day, there were about 7 tents left on site at Laurel Field. But again, not all the tents were occupied as a living space. So one of the tents that I was standing next to was not being used as a place for people to live in. it was being used for other activities that none of us would like to see in the park.
Thank you for that. So the other follow-up question is about resources. So I understand that there was, I don't know if it was a handout or just verbally given, but a list of resources to campers of places they could go or contact. And I was just curious if the administration was able to share who are those contacts or resources.
So on March 10th, 11th, and 12th at Jerry Field, or adjacent at Civic Field, the city invited service providers. They're probably, I can get the exact names, but it's who you might expect. Some of whom were on that presented here earlier today. We're there at Civic Field to offer their services and resources. We did not have a handout, and I think I would ask Eric to chime in, but anecdotally, I would share with you that it's entirely likely that every single camper knows what resources are available to them. These folks, many of them are, as you've heard before, they are the hardest to serve, and they're the hardest to serve for a reason. They've been in and out of the system. They are long-term campers. I don't believe that, to be really candid, I don't believe that a handout would have much impact or value at this point. But we did make those services available to folks prior to the Jerry Field cleanup.
Echoing what Brian said there, I'm not aware of a handout that was distributed. There were 4 senior staff members from the city on site at Laurel Park on Friday morning. None of the 4 of us handed anything out. We were consistent in our message to folks. When we were asked by not campers, but by members of the community, where are we supposed to go? Our response to them was, you are not allowed to stay in the park. It is illegal to camp in the park. And the first place to start is the base camp facility. And often the response would be, they can't go to base camp. Throughout the course of these days and cleaning these facilities up, or engaging with campers, or trying to find support, or talking to people as the case may be, and I have personally been in these camps many times over the last 4 or 5 months now, and I've talked to campers individually. I have often asked the question, why is base camp not an option for you? And almost consistently the response, well, the responses vary a little bit, but it is consistently, I choose not to go there. It does not fit into what I would like to do. One individual said those people are boring. He just needs a place to be weird. Okay, fine, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that, but that's a choice that individual makes. I'm sure that there are folks who, there was one individual on Friday that I'm aware of who had his stuff, or brought his stuff down to Maritime Heritage Park. And throughout the day, eventually asked if the city could store his property, to which we said, of course, yes. We dispatched the Public Works crew down to collect his belongings and store them at the Bellingham Police Department, like we do with that. And then he went to base camp. So the campers and people who are homeless, I hate to be, sorry for the terminology there, but people who are experiencing homelessness, who are in these locations, know very well that they have access to base camp and where to go to get that, or the Opportunity Council, or other options. But many of them, for various reasons, are either choosing not to use them, or ever making other choices in their life. So that's a difficult question, unfortunately, to address. And I hate that. I'm trying very hard not to generalize, because that's not the case. Each of these people are individuals. They very truly are. And they're good people to talk to, right? They're in a very difficult spot in their life, but we did not hand out a resource list. Brian's correct. We had the Civic Field Resource Facility available for a couple of days prior. We were consistent in our message on Friday that the first place to start is the base camp, and that there was space available on Friday morning for people to go. And we were also consistent in our message to campers that if you would like, we will store your belongings for up to 60 days. You tell us what to store and we will store it. If it is clean and we are able to, we will be happy to store those belongings. And we did have 1 or 2 people take us up on that, but by and large, folks chose not to use that resource.
Thank you for that follow-up. And I think it's important, I mean, that differentiation between those who are currently unhoused and sleeping in tents in our community, and volunteers in the community who have been making donations and providing, support in a variety of fashion, and protesters who have repeatedly articulated demands, right, to the mayor as well as council members through whether that be public comment in the form of, oral testimony or emails, voicemails, a variety of ways. But what Director Johnson just said is very important, that each of these people are individuals, and the work of the city and the continuum of services that we've been looking at, is really to provide a broad base of services and a wide variety of services, but services that are aimed at serving a broad population of individuals who are in sort of a particular place or have particular needs. And we're not in a position to be able to provide individualized services on a case-by-case basis, right? I mean, unfortunately, that's not what the city is able to do as a government entity, but we partner with social service agencies who, do a lot of that outreach within the community. But I feel like we've been silent, or maybe haven't addressed, what people were calling for. And I believe that we're likely all on the same page, but I think it's worth articulating clearly that when people are asking or demanding for absolutes, I mean, there's very rarely an absolute in any of the worlds that, I live or operate in. There's always some exception. And so things like amnesty for all protesters, to drop all charges and cease all investigations related to the 28th of January at City Hall. One, that raises concern for me as a council member with accountability and criminal activity in our community, and seeing things escalate and wanting to make sure that, that there is accountability, and that if things transpire, that we do follow through on that. And when we talk about permanent, no barrier housing for all, I think we've discussed that previously, but maybe not specifically articulated the harm that can do within, looking at that continuum of services and hearing from providers today. One of the gaps, wasn't sort of the need for a permanent no barrier housing, because I feel like permanent no barrier housing for all is something that, in my opinion, would undermine and sort of perpetuate homelessness, and would really restrict individuals' abilities to move through, right, and transition through those continuum of services. And I don't think it's something that we can, condone or support. And so when you're asked for something like that and saying, where are people supposed to go? The concern is about the misinformation about base camp and, well, people who have been using can't go there. And the reality is you can't use on site, right? I mean, there are places where these programs, yes, have rules, and the rules are in place to protect the residents there as well as the broader community. And it's an essential part of providing those services and being able to support people in finding success. And similarly, the permanent ban on all encampment sweeps. And I think we've acknowledged that our policy really has been to leave people in place. If this has been their choice and they are not, base camp isn't the place for them, or they're on hard times and they haven't been able to, secure sort of conventional housing as we know it, and they're maybe in a process, that we're not going to, just chase them around the city. But we do have some accountability issues with respect to public health and safety concerns. And the reality is that we can't turn a blind eye and say that all encampments, will never be touched. We've seen stark examples of the concerns for public health and safety that arise. And again, maybe sometimes it's, out of an individual's concern, but it's at a risk to the individual who's staying in that location and living in that situation, as well as to the broader community that surrounds, those individuals. And so I just really want the broader community to understand that what's being advocated for, I really believe, is a disservice to the people that these individuals are claiming to try and protect and serve. And so I want to, again, acknowledge the hard work of our staff and the teamwork across with the county and other service providers to really stay the course on this incredibly difficult journey, and acknowledge the broad support of programs that are in place and the actions that we talked about earlier today that we're taking to continue to expand funding and also expand capacity. And so certainly every individual matters, and we're hoping to be able to help everybody, but we also have to keep our eye on on making sure that we don't increase those numbers, right? And if we take our eye off the ball and sort of these programs further down the continuum that are helping rental assistance and other things that are helping to prevent people from slipping into the situation where they are unsheltered, that's that's, in my opinion, some of the most important work that we're doing, because at that point, you have much better fighting chance to keep someone there versus how much more difficult it becomes once you've lost that housing and now you're trying to re-enter. And so I'm not asking for a vote from the council, but I think that it's important that we're all on the same page in some respects, and that as an administration, as a council, that we're doing this work sort of in lockstep. There will be times when there's disagreement and some tensions and some pushback, but the reality is that we're all moving in the same direction with the same end goal in mind. So I just want to extend that appreciation and acknowledge that work continues, and we know there's a lot left to do. So any further comments or questions or concerns? We're an older new business. No. Okay. This afternoon going forward, we have now 3 items in executive session. So we're going to be breaking for executive session, and then we will reconvene this evening at 7 p.m. In executive session, we now have, like I said, 3 items. The first is potential litigation. This matter will be covered by Rafato, and that's changed to approximately 10 minutes. And item number 2, potential property acquisition, handled by Herb, for approximately 15 minutes. And the new addition is litigation, Bornstein Seafoods versus City of Bellingham et al. And that'll be covered by Brady, approximately 15 minutes. So council members have a separate link to join executive session.